Good morning. It's always kind of hard the week after a gospel meeting, especially one kind of like what we just had. It's always kind of hard to get back in because it's not always an easy act to follow, and I say that very tongue-in-cheek wise. Those of us that were here this last couple of weeks, or the last week, to be able to spend time with both the Jims, both Brother Jim Smelser and Jim McDonald, I think benefited greatly. And so being able to sit at their feet and listen to them was certainly a treat for me. I know it was a treat for y'all as well. I heard several compliments, several comments about these were some of the best lessons they had ever heard in their life. And so I understand that. I said that sarcastically, by the way. Those were awesome lessons, but very good lessons, I think, for all of us to hear, especially the session that we had on Saturday, the one that dealt especially with older people. I thought, I know it sounds kind of weird to say that it was beneficial to me because I'm only 28 years old, but it was very beneficial to me. Because the whole crux around that theme of that day was, what can we do for the kingdom as we get older in years? And I think that's exactly what both the Jims covered in spades. I thought it provided very applicable, very practical advice for everybody. And so we certainly grew. It's hard not to sit at the feet of men like both the Jims and not marvel at the Word of God, not marvel at His creation, and not marvel at His goodness that He's given to all of us. And so it was certainly a beneficial week, but now for the next year, you're stuck with me. And so that can either be a good thing or a bad thing. I pray that it'll be a good thing and pray that the next year will bring us closer to God. We're going to open up in our Bibles, if you would, to the book of Deuteronomy, specifically the last chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 33. So we'll begin here in just a second. If you're visiting with us, we especially want to offer a special invitation or a special thank you to you for spending your time with us. We know that you could probably choose to be several different places this morning rather than being at worship. But we're thankful that you've taken time out of your day to worship with us and to be with us. We certainly enjoy having fellowship one with another and having companionship one with another. It wasn't too long ago, and it seems like it kind of faded off into distant memory, but it wasn't too long ago that the Ebola virus spread throughout pretty much all of Dallas. And it came all over the world, especially in Africa, and jumped over to America, centralized kind of in New York, and then kind of drifted down. But in Dallas, especially for those of us that are here, that was kind of a trying time, if we remember that. That was a time of a lot of panic. A lot of people really didn't know what it was. A lot of people didn't know how it was contracted. And you always saw in the news reports people in hospitals that seemed to be just dying left and right of it. It's a terrifying disease, not only to know not only what it wasn't or what it was, but how you could contract it. And especially as we're seeing those reports in the news, a lot of us, I think, were filled with a lot of fear. Is it going to spread over here? Is it going to spread to these schools? And we saw a couple schools that had some scares with that. Is it going to stretch to Greenville? And so a lot of us, I think, kind of was a little bit of trepidation in regards to that. And while we look at those types of things, we look at cancer, we look at AIDS, we look at HIV, and all these diseases that spread throughout humanity, there's one disease that spreads throughout everybody that most of us probably don't even realize that it's there. I'm talking about the disease of depression. And that's the subject that we're going to be looking at here this morning. It's estimated that within the next 6 months, 1 out of every 30 people will become afflicted with depression at some point in their lives, or at some point within those 6 months. And for different people, it could be different things. It could be a clinical depression. Maybe there's a chemical imbalance there. For other people, it could be a very situational depression, something that comes on after the death of a loved one, or something maybe traumatic happened in their life. They lost their job, they lost a spouse, they lost something. And so that depression just kind of seeps into their life and it just destroys them. And when we look at the world as a whole, the thing we don't realize is a lot of people are struggling with that we may not even realize it. I want you to look at some of these quotes that we put up here on the board. I want you to see if you can identify who it is that struggles with this depression. Look at this first quote. This first person says, I was an outsider. I was the egghead from academia who got in because the rules had changed. And while I looked for validation from my fellow contemporaries, I instead found jealousy and envy. I did not find team spirit. This led to dissatisfaction and unease. And what I felt was depression. Does anybody know who that was? That would be the second man to walk on the moon, astronaut Buzz Aldrin. Think about this. Ever since that day, I've tried to be different. I know that I'm a better father. I try to be a better husband. I'm a better man, and I pray to God every night to be a better Christian. I pray every day and every night that I can help another alcohol and drug addict like me. Does anybody recognize that voice? That would be none other than Hall of Fame running back Earl Campbell, who had a lot of success on and off the field, wrote a memoir specifically dealing with his struggles with depression. And if you read that, you can't help but become gripped by the things that he has to say that he struggled with not only during his playing career, but especially since his playing career is over. Think about this one. This one's a little smaller, so I'll try to read this one a little bit clearer. It says, when no one listens to you, or you feel no one's listening to you, all sorts of things start to happen. For instance, you have so much pain inside yourself that you try and hurt yourself on the outside because you want help. I think we all know what they're talking about there. But it's the wrong help that you're asking for. People see it as a crying wolf or attention seeking. And they think because you're in the middle of the media all the time, you've got enough attention. But I was actually crying out because I wanted to get better in order to go forward and continue my duty and my role as a wife and as a mother. That quote would continue as a princess, Princess Diana. You can read some of the things that she had to say, especially in the interviews right before she died, that just comes to grips with how much she struggled with it. And we look at some of these people. We look at Earl Campbell. We think of Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, for crying out loud. And we think to ourselves, how can any of these people feel bad about themselves? How can Princess Diana, who had literally the world adoring her, those especially that knew her in the late 80s, early 90s, you can remember the adoration that this world had for a person like that. Now, her personal life wasn't spectacular. I think that goes without saying. But the world adored her. And so to look at these people and think to themselves, how could you have depression? It doesn't really seem to compute with us. What about this last quote? This last quote's a little easier to read. It says, I want to go home. I'm very homesick and I miss my family. It's not so much that I can't see them face to face, as much as it is that I've lost the ability to see them anytime I want. If I have a problem, I want to be able to go or talk or go see them. I am completely alone. Does anybody know who wrote that? That would be the person standing in front of you right now. Probably most of you know, and I've talked to several of you about this in the past, I have struggled with depression, I've struggled with social anxiety in my life, I've struggled with many of those things. And it's been kind of a battle pretty much throughout the course of my entire life. I, like many people like these, have this kind of mental issue in my family. My grandparents have struggled with it, my mom has struggled with it, several people within my family have struggled with it. And what you're reading there, especially in that quote, is a quote from one of my journal entries when I was in Africa. That was a hard time. And those of you who have ever spent 7 weeks in a tent in the middle of a third world country probably know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a very lonely, a very depressing time. I'm thankful to say that throughout the course of that journal, if you read especially towards the end, which none of you will ever get a hold of for the life of me, if you read towards the end of it, what you'll see is it steadily gets better, and steadily gets happier and happier. But the disease of depression is something that I've struggled with, and I know a lot of other people have struggled with. And you looked at some of these people for guidance, you looked at some of these people for inspiration, and think to yourself, if some of these people have struggled with it, then it's understandable that I have too. And what you read, especially in the Bible, as you read cover to cover, is all these great men and women that you read within the pages of Scripture. Guess what? They struggled with it too. You cannot read the Psalms without seeing a depression that was deep within David. You can't read the woes and the wailings about his son Abimelech without coming to grips with the fact that this, or face to face with the fact that this was a man who struggled with sadness and loneliness and depression and betrayal his entire life. One of the greatest prophets to ever grace the Old Testament, Jeremiah, wrote an entire book dedicated to wailing for Jerusalem. It was called Lamentations. He was known as the weeping prophet. You can't read the book of Job without seeing a man that is completely devastated and completely destroyed in who he was. And you can't read 1 Kings chapter 19 and look at Elijah there who's all by himself and not think to yourself, this is a man who literally has lost all sense of hope. The pages are filled with people that have struggled with depression their entire life. And although these four great, fantastic men and women are in front of you right there, I would be willing to bet that there's other people in this auditorium that have struggled with this too. I would be willing to bet that even though these four are the ones that we just happen to kind of randomly choose, and by the way, we could go on and on about Abraham Lincoln and his depression. There's an entire book called Lincoln's Melancholy that describes how his depression not only ruled his presidency, but made him the man that he was. And if these people can struggle with it, if I can struggle with it, I would guarantee you that there's other people in this room that have struggled with it or are struggling with it this very moment. The last song that we sang, number 394, was a special song for me. There's a couple songs that every time you sing them, you can't help but become moved by the words of it. And Leaning on the Everlasting Arms is one of those songs that I think speaks really to me, especially for this issue. And you don't have to open up to it, it's going to be on the screen. But if you read the words of those songs, if you read the words of that song, what you notice is a transition that Anthony Showalter goes throughout the course of this song. Verse 1 through 3, he kind of has a progression. And what you notice here, especially in this first one, he says, what a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace is mine, leaning on the everlasting arms. And when I look at that, I think about the possibility that exists within the fold of God. You look towards the second verse, and now he starts talking about the reality of walking with God. Oh, how sweet to walk in this pilgrim way, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how bright the path grows from day to day, leaning on the everlasting arms. And then when you get to the last verse, verse 3, it talks about the future that exists in front of him. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms. For I have blessed peace with my Lord so near, leaning on the everlasting arms. The way that Nathan led that is the exact same way that that song is supposed to be sung in 394. It's supposed to be sung very fast, very upbeat, because it's not supposed to be a song that's associated with depression. But if you ever hear a version of this song, 394, leaning on the everlasting arms, if you ever hear a song slowed down, then this song becomes incredibly haunting. Because what he's describing is somebody that is looking towards God as the only hope that exists in his life. Anthony Showalter wrote that song in the late 19th century after he received letters from two of his pupils who had lost their wives. And as he was writing letters of consolation, he started looking towards the pages of the Old Testament. Several of the men and women that we just described, looking towards the Old Testament, thinking to himself, how can I comfort these people? And he came to Deuteronomy chapter 33, especially in verse 27. Let's look at this real quick, because this is the verse, and these are the verses that spawn this writing of this song. If you remember, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 33, you remember that Deuteronomy as a whole, it's pretty much one gigantic sermon from Moses towards the people of Israel. Certainly the last things that he would have to say, and especially once you get to the end of Deuteronomy chapter 33, becomes very personal. Deuteronomy chapter 34 is where Moses dies at the top of Mount Nebo. And so as he's going towards the end of this sermon, he comes to the blessing of Israel. And verses 26 through 29 is his final words, or are his final words to these people. Listen to what he has to say to them. He says, there is none like the God of Jeshurun, who rides the heavens to your help and through the skies in his majesty. The eternal God is a dwelling place. Verse 27, this is the inspiration for the song. And underneath it are the everlasting arms. And he drove out the enemy from before you and said, destroy. And so Israel dwells in security. The fountain of Jacob is secluded in a land of grain and new wine. His heavens also drop down dew. Blessed are you, O Israel. Who is like you, a people saved by the Lord? Who is the shield of your help and the sword of your majesty? So will enemies, or so your enemies will cringe before you, and you will tread upon their high places. And that ends what Moses would have to say to these people. He doesn't end it with a go forth and prosper. He doesn't end it with a I hope you have good fortune. He ends it by telling them of the great things that God has done for them. And all throughout the course of those last 4 verses, what you see over and over again is Moses saying, God is with you, and God will be with you. As long as, verse 27, you lean in his everlasting arms. And it denotes a sense of comfort, and it denotes a sense of eternal peace that resides within resting in God's bosom. And tell me the Israelites, as they're coming towards the end of this, and they're hearing the end of this sermon, aren't found to be exceedingly peaceful about what they're reading. We can read this all day long. And as people that suffer with depression, I feel uniquely qualified, not actually that uniquely at all. But I feel like I can kind of speak to this. And not simply because the Bible speaks to it, but because I know what it feels like. And I'm sure I'm speaking to an entire auditorium of people that knows exactly what it feels like. And while it's easy to say to somebody that struggles with depression, well, just think your way through it, just get over it. Those who struggle with clinical depression, you may need medication. I've seen people, and there's no shame in it, you may need medication to help you get through it. But most people that struggle with situational depression, even just depression that ravages part of their lives, medication probably isn't your best avenue. What your best avenue is exactly what this song describes and what Deuteronomy chapter 33 describes, which is leaning on the everlasting arms of God. Now, that's easy to talk about. And it's easy to say, well, Linda, all you need to do is just lean on the everlasting arms of God and everything will be fine. The question is, what does that even mean? How do you do that? What it means first and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, is it means that we need to learn to trust God in the silence. Those of you who have struggled with depression know that depression can be a very lonely time period because you don't feel like anybody else in the world understands or knows what you're going through. And so it can be easy at one point to say to yourself, well, I'm all by myself, I don't have anybody else with me. And so because of that, God obviously doesn't know how I feel either. Look at 1 Kings chapter 18. We didn't discuss it earlier. I want to go to 1 Kings chapter 18. Actually, I lied. Look at the next chapter, 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19 kind of paints a good postscript on what happens in 1 Kings chapter 18. If you remember in 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah has this fantastic victory over the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And you would think after such a victory like that, you would think obviously whoever had that scene kind of in front of them would necessarily be uplifted by God. But when you look at 1 Kings chapter 19, especially within those first 3 verses, and you see the threats made by Ahab and Jezebel towards Elijah's life, Elijah is far from ecstatic. Elijah is far from happy. He's far from overjoyed. He's far from being confident in himself at all. And when you look at 1 Kings chapter 19, starting in verse 9, you find Elijah hiding in a cave. And it says in verse 9, then he came there to a cave and lodged there. Behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? In other words, you're a prophet of mine. What are you doing hiding in a tiny cave? And Elijah responds back, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. There's the situation. There's a situation that presents my depression, Elijah says. Verse 11, listen to God's response. So he said, go forth and stand on the mountains before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord wasn't in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And then he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Elijah responds twice in 1 Kings chapter 19 of what his situation is. And you see it there in verse 9. You see it there again in verse 14. I'm the only person in the world that's left. I saw what happened to all the other prophets of God. They had killed every single last one of them. And I'm on the run too. And if you look at Jezebel's threats there in the first couple of verses, Jezebel's not playing around. So be it for me, if you're not the exact same way as the rest of the prophets by this time tomorrow, she is out to kill him. And when God demonstrates his power towards Elijah, try to give him some semblance of comfort, did you see what happened there in verses 11 through 13? You have this great earthquake, and you have this great fire, and you have this great mountain that's torn just right down in two. But every single time after that, it says that God wasn't in those things. You know where God was? God was in the still small voice that passed gently in front of Elijah. When we think about the power of God, and we cry out to God for help in our own personal lives through prayer or whatever things it may be, we tend to think that God lives and works only in the gigantic. That if we want to hear the power of God, if we want to see the power of God, it's going to come in some momentous fashion. God, I lost my spouse. Well, if you're really real, then bring her back from the dead. God, I just lost my job. Well, if you're really real, have that phone call, sweep in, and give me my job back. And we think that we see God only in the fantastics. But what Elijah has pointed out, or what Elijah has shown in 1 Kings chapter 19, is that even though God exists sometimes in the fantastics, what he oftentimes exists in also is that still, small voice that exists in the world. That even though you may not be able to look out your front door and see God literally rending a mountain down in front of you, you know that he is still there. As one person put it, I thought very accurately, divine silence does not necessarily mean divine inactivity. We need to learn to trust God in the silence. That even when we don't see God, and we don't see the majestic works of Him every single day, trust that He is still there. Look also in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 starts off very prominently. And very interestingly, I've always thought 2 Corinthians 12, the first 6 verses were incredibly fascinating. Because what you read in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the first 6 verses, is this story that Paul is telling in the third person. He's telling the story about a person that he doesn't know. He's talking about himself. But he's talking about the story about a person who was raised to the third heaven and heard and saw all these things that he wasn't allowed or able to say or hear and really describe a whole lot. And for anybody that would experience something like that, you would think, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come home and I'm going to tell James. Because I just saw the third heaven, I saw God, I saw this, I saw that. God obviously really must love me because of what He showed me. But fascinatingly enough, in verse 7, Paul switches gears. And instead of talking about how awesome he was, which he doesn't really even say that in 6 verses, he's just describing it. But in verse 7, he kind of switches gears and talks about something polar opposite. But he says there in verse 7, because of the surpassing greatness of those revelations, those things that he has just seen, for this reason, because those things were so awesome, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Which anybody that would have ascended to heaven and see the things that Paul did, obviously would have thought very highly of themselves. Verse 8, concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it may leave me. And He has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. And most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am made strong. What Paul is describing here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 is, the first 6 verses, I ascended up into the third heaven, whatever specifically that has reference to. I ascended up to the third heaven, I saw all these fantastic things, I marveled at the glory of God right in front of me. Look at how awesome I am. But then starting in verse 7, because of that, and because of all these amazing things, I was given a thorn in the flesh to keep me a little bit humble. And even though I implored God 3 times that it would remove itself from me, God denied me every single time. Now here's the billion-dollar question. Why did God allow that thorn in the flesh to stay with Paul? And moreover, what did it do for Paul? What Paul reveals there in verses 8 through 10 is, because of those revelations, because of this thorn in the flesh, I not only realized how small I am, but I realized how awesome and glorified God is. What happens sometimes when we begin to think too highly of ourselves is we begin to think too little of what God is. And so when we're going through these bouts of depression, when we're going through these doubts of thinking that we're absolutely nothing, that we're not deserving of this, we're not deserving of that, what we need to learn in that silent period is not only God's abiding presence, but also the amazing power and the majesty that God wields. Learn to trust God in the silence. Also, we need to work to understand the power of prayer. The key word in that phrase is work. We all understand, we've talked about it sermon after sermon, we've talked about it in Bible class after Bible class, you've had it in conversation after conversation. We all know the power of prayer. We all know that it's the vehicle, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 20 through 24. We know that it's the vehicle by which we approach the throne of grace. We know that God allows us to approach Him because of all these different things. We know that we have that ability. But I would guarantee you that half the time when we're so conflicted with what's going bad in our lives, that we don't really understand that. That we know prayer is out there and we know it works. We know that God hears us, but we don't really understand it. And so because of that, we kind of push it off to the back burner. Kind of struggle with something. Well, you need to pray with it. I'm struggling with this. Well, you need to pray about that. Okay? What does that mean? Go to 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5 has 2 phrases that oftentimes we hear side by side. I'm sorry, that we hear a lot, but we don't think is being side by side. 1 Peter chapter 5, look at verse 6. Peter is describing or ending a book that has a lot to do with persecution, and Peter would know a lot about that. As Peter is ending this book, 1 Peter chapter 5, listen to what he has to say here in verse 6. Peter writes, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." That's a popular verse to hear whenever you have depression. Cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Verse 6, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. That's a little bit of what we discussed in the first point. And it has to do with giving every worry, every concern, every thought, every problem we have in our minds, letting God know about them, unveiling our heart towards him. But then verse 8 kind of sneaks in there. Have you ever noticed that? He says, "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert, for your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Have you ever stopped and thought to yourself why those two phrases are right next to each other? Why verse 7, when he says, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you," is right next to verse 8, "The devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." Have you ever wondered why those two verses are right next to each other? It's because Peter knew, and God knew in his infinite wisdom, that when we are at our lowest, when we're thinking that God doesn't care about us, when we're thinking that God doesn't even look at us anymore, it's at that point in our life that we're most susceptible to sin. Satan doesn't see anything more appetizing than a Christian who has lost faith in God, or a Christian who believes that God doesn't have his best interests at heart. And so when he says here in verse 7, "Cast all your anxiety on him," even the little things, even the things you think don't matter, even the things you think God doesn't care about. Verse 7 ends with, "Because he does care about you." And moreover in verse 8, "Because you don't want to look appetizing to Satan." God doesn't want any of us to fall. And so when we talk about prayer, when we talk about understanding the power of prayer, it's much more than just, it's something that I need to do. It's the vehicle by which we restore our faith in who God is. Ladies and gentlemen, what could be more powerful than that? 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13 needs to be at the forefront of our mind when we're talking about depression anyways. Remember 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 13? Most of you could probably quote it. "No temptation has overtaken man except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with that temptation will also" what? Do you remember what it is? "Provide that way of escape." If you're sitting here this morning thinking to yourself, "God doesn't care about me," or "God's forsaken me," or "these string of events that have happened in my life have led me to believe that God has turned his face on me," keep 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 13 forefront of your heart. Because no temptation has overtaken you, or overtaken man, except what is common to man. God will provide the way of escape. Have confidence that whatever you're going through in your life, no matter how nutso it is, you could lose your entire family, lose your income, and your wife turn against you like Job did. Even something like that, you are still able to have faith in God if you're willing. Learn to harness the power of prayer to cast all your anxieties on him and not try to indwell them, not try to make them only your problem. Finally, we need to learn to trust God's people. This is something that has been especially hard for me to do. I'm sure it's something that's been especially hard for a lot of people to do. When you struggle with depression, when you struggle with anxiety, when you struggle with down thoughts, the last thing you want to do is look vulnerable to other people. I don't want Todd knowing my issues. I don't want Jeff Driggers calling me up at 10 o'clock at night. "Hey, just making sure you're still around. How you doing? You still watching Matlock? I've got my Ovaltine." Nobody wants other people to know their business. Maybe we're embarrassed of it. Maybe we're struggling with something that is incredibly embarrassing that we don't want Jeff Driggers to know about. Or maybe we're so down about something so minor and so tiny that the idea that Ray would even know about it is embarrassing to me. And so because of that, we don't learn to look towards other people. We don't learn to throw our anxieties not only on God, but also on other people. There was a study done by Duke University in 1999 that did a study of almost 4,000 older adults. And one of their conclusions that they reached, and it was a study that was done pretty much exclusively on depression, was done exclusively on anxiety. One of the results that they came to was that attendance at a house of worship is related to lower rates of depression and anxiety. Now, you can make all sorts of reasons for why that is, whether it's thinking about something else besides yourself and worshiping God. I think that's a part of it. I think a part of it, too, is you're a part of a community of people that cares about you. Let me tell you something right now. There's nobody in this world that knows what you're going through like another Christian. If you're struggling with depression because you're struggling with the temptation that's in your life, nobody knows how bad that temptation can be and the effects of succumbing to that temptation like another Christian. That's why we have other Christians. That's why we gather together. That's why we huddle together in this building. Is to lean on each other for extreme warmth, as I can see a couple people fanning themselves. We lean on each other. And we grow together. That's why we have elders. I think Paul and Shell are here just to kind of hold pews down and make sure that we have somebody on the slip to make sure that if something happens in the building, we've got liability. I'm not here for that. Paul and Shell voluntarily filled those positions to help us, me, you, get together. Use them. Call them up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Paul is not asleep, I promise you. I want us to look at one final passage, 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Shell might be asleep, but Paul's up. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 4. Paul the Apostle is known for being a lot of things. You can read, and we have certainly things to read. We're running quickly out of time. You can read a lot about the things that Paul the Apostle went through in his life. And there is no doubt that Paul went through an unspeakable amount of things. And Paul was a model Christian for a lot of people. He mentioned there in 1 Corinthians, I think it's either 1 or 2 Corinthians chapter 11, imitate me as I also imitate Christ. Paul was certainly a worthy model of following or an example. But as great as Paul was, and as much as Paul prayed, and Paul being filled with the Holy Spirit, all these things that Paul had, Paul still needed other people. And when you look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, you see that in spades. You can see in verses 6 down through verse 9, or 6 down through verse 8, that Paul is ready to accept what's about to happen to him. He understands that he's being poured out as a drink offering. But listen to this in verse 9. He says, make every effort, Timothy, to come to me soon. Now why would Paul say that? Why would Paul tell Timothy, a young man at the writing of this, why would he tell Timothy, make every effort, do everything possible to come to me soon? We're about to find out in verse 10. For Demas, having loved this present world, that can mean a lot of things, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus has gone to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. But Tychicus I've sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak which I left at Troas with Carpus and the books, especially the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard, verse 15, against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. Verse 16, at my first offense, nobody supported me, but all deserted me. May not be counted against them. Verse 17, a little glimmer of hope. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, and that all the Gentiles might hear, and I was rescued out of the lion's mouth. As Paul is closing up his life, and you can read in Philippians, you can read in Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, the letters to the Thessalonians, you can see a remarkable amount of courage in Paul's writings. But in 2 Timothy chapter 4, when he personally is alone, when he personally is facing these battles, what is he asking for? Nobody would walk up to Paul at this point in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and say, you know what you need, Paul? You just need to pray more. What you need is you need a little bit more faith. Now, all of us could use a little bit more prayer and a little bit more faith. I'm not saying that's not important. But what did Paul need? He needed other Christians. And ladies and gentlemen, if Paul the Apostle needed other Christians to stand by him, then you and I do too. What you find, especially in reading the book of 2 Corinthians, is Paul is defending himself. One of the passages there in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 says, we were persecuted, but not destroyed. We were afflicted, but not destroyed. We were perplexed, but not downtrodden. We. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're struggling with depression, especially depression of a spiritual nature, do not make the fatal mistake to think that you can do it without God and without other people. Learn to lean on other people that God has blessed you with. Learn to lean on the church that God has blessed us with. Revelation chapter 21 verse 4 has a lot of things to say about, actually Revelation 21 has a lot of fantastic things to say about heaven. And as you read Revelation 20 and 21, you can't help but come to grips with the fact that heaven is going to be a fantastic place. You have streets of gold, you have walls that are encrusted with jewels, you have the presence of God there day and night, and that's all fantastic.
You know, one of the things that makes me the happiest in Revelation chapter 21 in descriptions of heaven is found in Revelation chapter 21 and verse 1. When it says, He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. The struggles, the temptations, the downtroddenness, the emotional lows that we sometimes get to, all those are things of this world. And that's why God has adequately blessed us to be able to overcome them through Him and through other Christians and through His Word. But if you're not a Christian this morning, none of this applies to you. If you're not a Christian this morning, if you haven't named Him in baptism, if you've strayed from His path for whatever reason, none of this applies to you. None of this. You can look to other Christians, but they won't be able to identify you. They don't know how to help you if you're committed to living in the world. You can pray towards God and you can lean on His Word, but only after you first subjected yourself to Him and humbled yourself under His cross. That's the first step, ladies and gentlemen. If you have need of the gospel call, I invite you, and this church invites you. Won't you come as we